Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our fall Holtzbrinck lecture entitled Visions of Tolerance, the 1960s Experiment to Desegregate the Boarding Schools of the American South. This will be presented by our Holtzbrinck Fellow, Mosey Secret, who is, I'm happy to say, here at the American Academy in Berlin. He's one of the three hardy souls we have in residence in this COVID blighted season. And we've been delighted to have Mosey here, and he's got an absolutely great story to tell. So I'm delighted you can join us. The Holtzbrinck Fellowship was established in 1999 with the generous support of the Holtzbrinck Media Group. Over the years, this fellowship has been intended to promote German-American dialogue in the fields of journalism, nonfiction, and fiction. And it's made it possible for more than 35 outstanding writers with backgrounds in academia, journalism, or other areas to come here for a residency in Berlin. Among them, Alex Ross and Hilton Als of the New Yorker, Jonathan Safran Foer, and George Packer. Although Mosey Secret is here at Berlin, we are in Berlin. We're sorry to say that we could not do this as an in-person event as we would have hoped due to the pandemic. And we're very sorry that we can't have the usual crowd here at the Hans Arnold Center. But on the other hand, there are some upsides we've all found to communing by Zoom. And one of them is that we are fortunate to have Kelly Varela join us to introduce, interrogate Mosey, and then to moderate the question and answers afterward. Let me just say that when we do come to the question and answers, please do use the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you hit some other button that says you can put up your hand, no one will see it. So please do use that function, and please feel free to start asking questions as soon as you feel like it. You don't need to wait for the end of the discussion. Our discussant tonight, Kelly Varela, is a senior staff editor on the international desk of the New York Times. She's been a journalist for 20 years and has worked as an investigative reporter and editor, an audience engagement editor, and founding editor of a news organization focused on the African American community in New York City. She is the winner of the 2013 Digital Media Entrepreneur Pitch Competition of the International Women's Media Foundation. Kelly grew up in Alabama and Georgia. She attended integrated public schools there in the 80s and the 90s. And so she is an excellent person to be our discussant tonight. Thank you, Kelly, so much for joining us. I hope all is reasonably well in New York, but it's great that we can have you here and take on the honors.
Good evening. Thank you guys for having me. I really, really appreciate getting the opportunity to come together and talk with you about Mosey and his work. It's very exciting for me. Mosey and I have been friends for 13, 14 years, and I feel like we've really traveled this process of our careers in journalism together. And so it's really wonderful for me to get a chance to see him flourish and, talk about this book, which I believe will be spectacular. And I'm very excited to see it, come to fruition. Let me tell you a little bit about Mosey. So Mosey is an independent journalist who's based in Brooklyn. He got his BA in comparative religion from Harvard. And after that, he worked as a reporter for the Times, for the New York Times. And he has also worked as a nonprofit, he's also worked as an investigative reporter for ProPublica, and he's worked as a reporter for several alternative news weeklies. He has received several awards. He has received the Silurians Award for news feature writing, Case Medal for meritorious journalism, the North Carolina Press Association Award for investigative reporting, and a 2019 Silvers Grant for work in progress from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation. He's also done several really cool fellowships. He's done the New America Foundation Fellowship and the Knight Wallace Fellowship at the University of Michigan. And he's also the recipient of a 2020 Visiting Journalist Fellowship from the Russell Sage Foundation. So I want to tell you a little bit about Mosey's, the project that Mosey's working on right now with the Academy, and he'll go into much more detail. But the big picture is that he's working on his book, which he wants to call Teaching Them, the 1960s Experiment to Desegregate the Boarding Schools of the South. And it is about an experiment to integrate elite private schools of the South. So just in a nutshell, starting in the late 1960s, a handful of white Southern philanthropists quietly worked to change their region's racist character. Their idea was to recruit and pay for 140 talented Black and brown girls and boys to integrate into all white Southern boarding schools, which were then havens for white families fleeing court-ordered integration. The strategy was novel. Could they make the children of white Southern elites, whom the philanthropists assumed were the South's future politicians, bankers, and industrialists, less bigoted by exposing them to Black scholarship students? For 10 years, the Stouffer Foundation, founded by Ann Cannon Forsyth and based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, attempted to fashion a social science study of those results. So Mosey heard about this project in 2015, and a lot of the world heard about it when he published a story about it in the New York Times Magazine, including myself. He did not tell me about it in advance, but I remember thinking, wow, this is really cool, and just being really excited about the potential that I saw in this thing. And I'm so glad that other people have too. But until he reported this story, actually those student stories and fates had never been recorded before. And that philanthropic group that sponsored these scholarship students and initiated this whole thing had remained silent about it. They hadn't really talked about their work. So what Mosey's going to be doing in this book is reconstructing a narrative history of that experiment, which will trace the arc of the students' lives and examine the era's promise to desegregate American schools and professions. I guess without further ado, we will give Mosey a chance to talk about it.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Dan. Kelly, it's so nice to be here with an old friend. I really appreciate your doing this. And Dan, and to everyone at the Academy, I'm so grateful for this opportunity. When I started this journey, like you said, 5 years ago, I could not have imagined that it would have brought me here to Berlin. So to all of the people who have made that possible, the staff here, who have helped me up until the last moment to get this Zoom presentation ready, I'm very grateful. My wife, whose passport got me into Europe, I'm of course very grateful to her, and all the supporters of the Academy. I'm thankful, particularly the Holtzbrinck family, which endowed the fellowship that brought me here. The presentation that I'm going to do, essentially, I kind of came to it and thinking about it as a kind of essay. The book, as I've learned working on my first book, it has been something that has informed my life, and my life has informed the book. And so I wanted to find a way to respond to this kind of post-George Floyd moment that we're in, to see if I could connect what's happening around us now to the ideas and history that I've uncovered in this narrative. So that's what follows. It will be a keynote presentation, which I will share with you. I'll share my screen with you. I'm going to switch back and forth between the camera and the keynote presentation, so bear with me if things are kind of slow, but that's how it'll go. So I am really excited about this opportunity to explore some ideas around race and racism and healing in the United States, in this forum that has for so long fostered an open exchange of ideas. I hope you see our discussion, like I do, as a chance for us to collectively spark your own thinking on these topics, since my talk provides no real answers, only questions about the nature of race and racial consciousness, and about our potential as human beings to understand each other. So here we are on a Tuesday evening in Berlin, and an afternoon or morning in other parts of the world, 11 months into a global pandemic and 6 months since the police in Minneapolis, Minnesota killed George Floyd, another unarmed Black person sparking mass protests in the United States and around the world, and amplifying a very old conversation about white supremacy. Over the summer, I was in New York, where I live with my wife in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant. And like everyone else, I watched so much change so quickly. In advance of this evening, I've been thinking most about the movement that materialized after George Floyd's death, as millions and millions of furious people burst out of pandemic lockdown and took to the streets. White Americans and even white people globally signaled that they were finally ready to do the work of uprooting white supremacy. We could see the entry into the mainstream of the idea of anti-racism, the spread of reading lists for white Americans to educate themselves, corporations changing their policies overnight, policy changes at the local level. I remember a conversation with one of my more skeptical Black friends. Who, after seeing all of this and after seeing the public conversation shift, felt hopeful that the ideas and beliefs and misconceptions that help give white Americans a privileged status over Black Americans and other people of color were crumbling. I will admit that I felt hopeful too. I am a writer and a storyteller interested above all in people's motivations. What most fascinates me about what we've seen and about what we're seeing is the psychology of this moment. My mind keeps returning to a question that even now is difficult for me to pin down. That is, what stories do people tell themselves or not tell themselves that allow them to overlook and live with such deep and vast racial inequality as exists in the United States, in the criminal justice system, in education, and healthcare? In the upheaval following Floyd's death, were those invisible fictions becoming visible? What new stories will we tell? Just a very quick and crude example of what I mean. As a child from middle America who visits New York City for the first time, or many other big cities, might be shocked at the sight of desperately homeless people and obviously mentally ill people on the subway. And it'll be natural for the child to ask, why does this happen? Some adults might even ask this question. It's a natural response for human beings, children especially, I think, to recognize when other human beings, for whatever reason, are not able to fully express their humanity. But most who live in the city long enough will find stories and justifications, explanations for why those people exist in our society until eventually, those people will become nearly invisible or exist on the periphery of our perception and of our consciousness. Most parents will find something to tell their children to put them at ease. So what are those things we used to see, that children used to see, that we no longer see when it comes to systemic racism and white supremacy in the United States? The meaning of race has changed over the ages, from a sign of God's pleasure or displeasure to an indicator of evolutionary development. Race has been seen as a key to intelligence and as a signifier of what part of the world we come from. In the United States, up until the protest movements of the 1960s, the common sense notion among most white Southerners was that Black people were inherently inferior. But we have done away with that idea, in the mainstream at least. So what are the stories we tell ourselves now? It's a strange question, and maybe a naive one, because we can so easily point to a long history of racism and laws and institutions and systems. Still, I wonder, without calling into question those racist systems, how they live inside of people's heads, what justifications get passed on that render white supremacy invisible, tolerable, not as deeply painful as it should be. Is it possible for people, white people in particular, to uncover and change those stories as more of them were attempting to do after George Floyd died? Or are we all beholden to our rather cruel past? I'm currently researching and writing about what happens when people of different racial backgrounds take on the work of anti-racism in interpersonal encounters. Can they learn to really see each other? A few years ago, I stumbled on a curious history in the United States that touches on many of these questions. It is this history that I would like to explore with you tonight. First, a bit of background. In the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, Black Americans, as you well know, began to agitate and organize against Jim Crow rule, the government-sanctioned system of segregation that regulated Black Americans to a second-class, less than fully human status. A system that had been in place more or less since white Southerners were forced to stop enslaving Black people. The civil rights movement shocked white people in the southern states who, having inherited the legacies of a system of forced Black labor, had hypnotized themselves with the fiction that Black Americans occupied their lower socioeconomic status because of a lower biological and psychological nature. Not only that, white Southerners believed that a characteristic of this subhuman nature was a feeling of happiness. That is, that Black people's second-class status was one that, on a daily basis, made them smile. This myth of the so-called happy Negro was passed on like mother's milk to Southern children and believed wholeheartedly. Only through the power of mass protests were segregation and Jim Crow rule dismantled. The Black spirit unleashed by the civil rights movement could not coexist with white beliefs in happy Negroes. White Americans were forced to face themselves. Even still, in the late 1960s, there remain people who I've taken to calling holdouts. White Southern Americans who use their wealth to insulate themselves from the rapid changes happening in society, to hold on to the old myths, and especially to their power, which was so often vested in all white institutions. Many of these institutions were privately run residential schools or boarding schools, for parents could quite literally send their children away to the pristine countryside to learn and be groomed implicitly, but also explicitly to inherit their whiteness. In 1967, 13 years after the United States Supreme Court ruled it illegal to segregate children by race in public schools, most of these private boarding schools remained all white, holdouts. It was these keepers of the myth of white supremacy, that is, the white students enrolled at these schools, whose minds a small group of progressives in the South wanted to change. This woman is Mrs. Ann Cannon Forsyth II, pictured here with her husband, Dr. Frank Forsyth. Mrs. Forsyth was a wealthy philanthropist from North Carolina who inherited her wealth from industrialists on her mother's and her father's sides of the family, most notably from her grandfather, R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco industrialist. Forsyth gave money to progressive causes and through various life experiences came to believe in the idea that if you put young people of different backgrounds together in close quarters, if they could get to truly know each other, that they would have profound conversion experiences and learn to see the world differently and grow and change. She thought that she could change the holdouts in these schools. The schools educated the leadership class, and Forsyth thought that by helping future leaders to become less racist, she might improve all of society. Her plan for doing this was to provide scholarships for Black boys and girls to racially integrate these boarding schools. There, Black students and white students would study, play, sleep, and eat in the same space. White students, Forsyth hoped, would discover the inherent capacity of their Black schoolmates, the inherent humanity, and uproot those old myths through the power of the encounter. I should say that the Black children who had received scholarships in their families were not empty ciphers. They brought their own beliefs into this equation. As it relates to this experiment, and this integration program was an experiment, Black Americans brought an almost religious belief in the power of education. Their second-class status, so invisible to white Americans from the South, was of course quite real to Black Americans. And for them, one solution to this accident of history was to teach themselves, to learn, to go to school, to set loose the minds that had been throttled by enslavement and by Jim Crow. For many, this belief in the power of education, by Black parents especially, outweighed even the very justifiable fear that white people would respond to Black children's presence in school with senseless violence. So when Ann Forsyth's foundation came offering what was considered a top-notch education, many Black families agreed. Forsyth started and financed her program called the Stouffer Foundation with some of her friends, and the group's job was to find just the right Black students to make it work. Chief among Forsyth's friends were John Ely, a novelist of local renown, and his wife, a British stage actress, Rosemary Harris. With a few others, they searched the South for the most talented Black students, testing them, interviewing them, meeting their families. Many of those interviews with students were tape recorded more than 50 years ago, tapes that are now in university archives. I want to share some of that audio with you now to help you bring all of this to life. In the first interview, we'll hear a 14-year-old boy named Doug talking with Rosemary Harris, the British actress. They talk about Doug's grades in school, about Doug's science fair project, and what he thinks makes a good teacher.
Our French teacher, he's a good teacher, but he just can't keep a quiet class. Most of the class is quiet until they get in French.
They don't like French.
But his classes are kind of boring.
Are they? Do you like French?
Yes.
How many years have you done French?
I think this will be my 6th.
Oh, you've done a lot of French. Can you speak any? Say anything?
Je parle français un tout petit peu.
Very good. Good accent. Well pronounced. Better than mine, I think.
Next, we'll hear John Ely, the novelist and husband to Rosemary, interviewing a student the foundation recruited. The student told John his hobbies were chemistry and eating.
I love to eat.
What do you like to eat most?
Well, I like to eat pizza,
What is pizza? Oh, yeah, sure.
French fries, cheeseburger, milkshakes.
Your taste in eating is no count at all, is it? Oh, my.
Another student told John he was worried about the effects of studying too hard.
But I believe I should study hard, but don't push myself to exhaustion and, till I get a nervous breakdown.
You don't look like you're going to have one, if I may say so. You don't feel like you're going to have one soon, do you? Oh, I agree with you. Now, these prep schools are harder than public schools.
By the way, I cut these recordings from a podcast I did for This American Life. That's why you'll hear a little music. I want to play just a couple more of them for you because I really love that all these years later, these early scenes from this effort still exist. All of these kids were chosen for the integration program. They went on to the white boarding schools. What you can hear most of all is that they are children, very young. John and Rosemary don't tell the kids that the program was hoping to change the minds of white students. They wouldn't tell the white students either. The encounters they hoped to foster would be, in a way, accidental, the byproduct of normal interaction in school. In these next interviews, they wait until the very end to even bring up the fact that the students will be integrating white schools. They mention race, but in an offhand way.
You want to go away to school?
Yes.
Well, you wouldn't be homesick at school, would you?
I don't think so.
Are you worried at all about going to because these are all, these prep schools in the South are really all white. Does that idea bother you at all?
No.
What experience have you had with integration? This school isn't very integrated, is it?
In case it isn't clear, when Rosemary asks whether Doug's school is very integrated, she's referring to Doug's public school where they were conducting the interview. As you'll hear in a bit, Doug answers no.
No. In the 6th grade, I had a friend named Freedom. And he acts about as crazy as I do sometimes.
Was he white?
Yes.
What was his name?
Freedom.
Oh, that's rather a nice name. So you really don't find any difference between a white boy and a black boy?
No.
If he's got the right qualities. That's good.
The first Stouffer scholarship recipients entered schools in the fall of 1967, 13 years after the United States Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision. There were 20 Black teenagers placed in 7 prep schools that year. In small town Virginia, in the mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina, on the affluent side of Atlanta, all schools that had historically only accepted white children. Over the next 10 years, 140 students would participate. Here's another interview.
Does it bother you the thought of going to a predominantly white boarding school?
No, I find that if you have a good sense of humor, you can get along with people well. It doesn't make any difference what race it is. If you can get along with people, you can get along with any type of people.
Sure. And you feel you can, if anybody is kind of unpleasant, you feel you can rise above it and...
Yes.
Good. Not that you're going to have any difficulty, but...
Not that you're going to have any difficulty. Can this program help high school age students form new friendships across racial lines and turn against their upbringing and the reality they know? Might those white students, thusly transformed, grow up to change Southern society? And must Black people always take on the burden of re-educating white people? Before we take a closer look, maybe we can get a better sense of what our holdouts were holding on to. At the risk of ruining the suspense, I should say that I don't think that in searching for their beliefs, we'll find the keys to ending white supremacy. Ending racism is certainly not what happened when we look back on the Stouffer Foundation's history. Still, for my purposes at least, our search is instructive because it gets me a little closer to understanding the imaginations that worked to keep racist systems in place. Historians of white Southerners in the age of civil rights tell us about how the direct action of the civil rights movement called into question white Southerners' very reality, which, as it turned out, was a false reality. It is not the interracial confrontations, important and tragic as they were, that are of prime significance, wrote the historian John Hope Franklin. It is the South's confrontation with change, its response in defending what is regarded as a perfect society that is instructive. And Franklin wrote that the white South's obsession was to maintain a government, an economy, an arrangement of the sexes, a relationship of the races, and a social system that has never existed, except in the fertile imagination of those who would not confront either the reality that existed or the change that would bring them closer to reality. As we've seen, a big piece of their imagined reality was a belief in the inferior but happy Negro. In an interview with the historian Jason Sokol, one white farmer told of how, before the movement, white people felt, quote, undisturbed by the Negro race. The farmer said, you had the Black fellow as a happy fellow. He sings all day, and he don't worry about where his food is coming from tomorrow. Sokol writes that these white assertions of Black happiness stemmed more from whites' psychological needs to believe in social harmony than from any evidence that such harmony actually existed. For white people to admit that Black people who worked so close to them in the fields and in their stores were in fact simmering with rage, a perhaps murderous rage that was kept in check only by unspeakable white violence, was for those white people in the Jim Crow South to face their own inhumanity. Black people were not happy, fulfilled, satisfied, or content under Jim Crow. Many white people claimed affection for Blacks, but they did not know the real desires and fears of Black people. Or as one journalist of the era wrote, the heart of the problem is not that the white man refuses to sit down at the table, but rather that when he does, he refuses to see the real face of the man he's sitting across from. The Stouffer Foundation wanted to help white people see. Forsyth and Ely began imagining their program around the time of the historic March on Washington in 1963, which we most remember for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's iconic I Have a Dream speech. Dr. King distilled an idea that helped propel the civil rights movement to its crescendo that day, an idea that drives the most famous lines from the speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, King said. He dreamed that one day down in Alabama with its vicious racists, one day right there in Alabama, little Black boys and Black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The idea of colorblindness, an almost common sense notion to us today, at the time had a radical edge because it totally undermined Jim Crow rule in the South. Knowingly or unknowingly, the Stouffer Foundation attempted to use this notion of colorblindness to pry loose those old myths that sustained white Southerners. As carriers of this idea, the Black students were under an incredible amount of pressure. Even at their young ages, it was not lost on them that they had to shine in those schools because they were the good face of all Black people. It is something of a paradox that these emissaries of colorblindness could never be average, regular Black people. They had to be amazing. Still, most of the students responded to this call. In my earlier journalistic explorations of this history for the New York Times Magazine and for This American Life, I told the story of Bill Alexander and Marvin Bernard, who in 1967 became the very first Black student at a boarding school in Lynchburg, Virginia, called Virginia Episcopal School. Bill was from a middle-class family, the son of a preacher from Nashville, Tennessee. Marvin was from a poor family in Richmond, Virginia. You can get to know them more if you read or listen to my earlier features, but for now, the key thing to know is that Bill and Marvin were exceptional beyond measure. When they started at Virginia Episcopal School, the school had the practice of publicly posting student rankings based on the students' grade point averages. And at the end of each semester, Bill and Marvin's very first semester at the school, at the end of each semester, they would post these grade point averages. Bill and Marvin's very first semester at the school, they topped all of their white classmates, finishing first and second in their class. And they repeated the feat every semester for the next 4 years. As Marvin told me a couple of years ago, those white boys knew. Bill and Marvin believed that because they shone like stars, their white classmates had truly seen them, but they would find out later that they were mistaken. Martin Luther King was assassinated during the spring of their second semester at school. Bill and Marvin, who were roommates, were in their dormitory bedroom when the news came over the radio that King had been gunned down. Their moment of deep sadness was cut short by a swell of laughter coming from their white classmates who were celebrating the news in the halls. We made some miscalculations about how people felt in their hearts, Marvin told me. They hardly knew what they were up against. When the school decided to open its doors to them, most parents had revolted. Why have you done this cruel thing to our beloved school? One parent wrote to the Board of Trustees. A private boarding school like VES is an extension, a part of the family, another wrote. We have no intention whatsoever of integrating those of another race into our family. And today, though the school will forever commemorate their star Black alums, when I ask Bill and Marvin's white classmates, white men in their 60s now, about whether they are changed by their encounters with Bill and Marvin, I hear a common refrain. I don't see color. I don't see color. The American sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winant, in their classic book, Racial Formation in the United States, point to Martin Luther King's assassination and the uprisings and fires of 1967 and 1968 as a pivotal moment in history when the notion of colorblindness began to be twisted. The Black-led movement had been successful by drawing on fundamental American ideals and cherished beliefs and opening up the opportunity for radical democratic transformation, the sociologists argue. The governing racial regime was seriously challenged, so the powerful reacted by working to demobilize the Black movement and the other anti-racist movements it spawned. Re-articulating the idea of colorblindness was a part of that effort. Colorblindness is a highly contradictory phenomenon, Omi and Winant wrote. In the past, it was a call for racial equality and inclusion. Today, it is largely an ideological framework for the effacement of race consciousness. They add, race thinking, it is argued, no longer significantly informs our perceptions, shapes our attitudes, and influences our individual, collective, and institutional practices. Indeed, it is said that the most effective anti-racist consciousness, policy, and practice is simply to ignore race. We are urged to see people as individuals only. If we return to the question of myths that obscure our reality, is colorblindness the myth that blinds us to the racism before our very eyes? Michelle Alexander, in her classic book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, asks whether affirmative action, by which I mean opportunity programs targeting Black people and other people of color, programs that have helped elevate a select number of Black Americans to the highest levels of American society. Alexander asks whether those programs offer, quote, relatively meager material advantages, but significant psychological benefits to people of color, in exchange for the abandonment of a more radical movement that promised to alter the nation's economic and social structure. Alexander says that seeing Black people like Bill and Marvin and the other graduates of the Stouffer program graduate from Harvard and Yale and become doctors or corporate lawyers, or similarly seeing a Black man become president of the United States, leads to exaggerated claims of racial progress and overly optimistic assessments of the future for African Americans, rendering a vast Black underclass invisible. It's an assertion that I'm inclined to agree with, but one that hits painfully close to home. When I was a teenager, I went to a mostly white private school in Atlanta, Georgia, as a scholarship student through a program very similar to the Stouffer Foundation's. When I met the Stouffer graduates during my research and reporting, I felt like they were my forebears, the ones who opened the doors for me. I built a life around notions of colorblindness. I've been intentional about making and caring for friends from various racial backgrounds. My wife is a white woman from Denmark. I can remember when I was younger, having a guarded feeling around white people, a sense that I was blocking some part of myself. I did not want to feel that. I'd seen the anger from Black people in my parents' generation, justifiable anger, but I did not want that. I learned about how race is a constructed idea, so I started the work of deconstructing race in my life. I want to believe in the open encounter, especially as a storyteller, to believe that we can truly see each other. Yet my research on this project has clarified for me the mixed legacy of this thinking, inherited from these programs, and brought me to something of a head-spinning crisis. The sociologists Omi and Winant describe it perfectly. We have not yet emerged from this ongoing pattern of racial contradiction, the chronic racial dilemma we are still all in. It is quite mind-boggling when looked at as a whole. On the one hand, the old verities of established racism and white supremacy have been officially discredited, not only in the United States, but fairly comprehensively around the world. On the other hand, racially informed action and social organization, racial identity and race consciousness continue unchecked in nearly every aspect of social life. On the one hand, the state, many states around the world, now claims to be colorblind, non-racialist, racially democratic, while on the other hand, in almost every case, those same states need race to rule. Consider it in the United States alone. Race and electoral politics, race and social control, race and legal order. Why don't our heads explode under the pressures of such cognitive dissonance? Why don't our heads explode? Is there no real potential for an interpersonal kind of exchange, for opportunities to really see each other and unveil white supremacy? For us to intentionally embody the change that will tear down systems? Or will such shifts in perspective continue to take mass Black death in the wake of a pandemic, or horrific videos of Black people being murdered by police flying around the internet? Since May, the Black Lives Matter movement has managed to pull white people into the anti-racism movement in significant numbers. That makes me feel good. But look at the horrors it took. And already a national poll found that all racial groups except Black people have shown a decreased interest in the Black Lives Matter movement since June. We need more hope than that. How do we socialize our children? The Stouffer Foundation was flawed, but I still find heroism in the attempt to root out racial myths among white people. What to do? I'll wrap up with an idea from the sociologist Omi and Winant, who had the good mercy to finish their study of race and racism on a hopeful note. They wrote, No one, no matter what their racial identity is, can be free of racism in their heads or hearts. It is too deeply ingrained in the US social structure. Structural racism determines that a comprehensive system of advantages and disadvantages, economic, political, cultural, and psychological, suffuses US society. Yet a great deal of thought and action has been devoted to the problem of fostering anti-racist practices at the individual and experiential level. Developing these skills, fostering the interruption and interrogation of racism, and extending the reach of anti-racism in the workplace, politics, family, school, cultural life, and indeed every interaction is an important dimension of the practice we want to support. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope that it gets you thinking. If you're curious about the journalism features that inform this work, you can find them on the web under the titles listed here or on my website. I would like to reiterate my thanks to the Academy, to Dan, to Kelly for their help and support, and to everyone for being here. I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Wow, Mosi, thank you so much for that. That was great. Like I told you when we first started talking about this, as I got to understand what you would be talking about today, I felt like it was really eye-opening. I felt like it opened up so much of my understanding of who you were as a person. And it's just really interesting to me that in all these years, we've never actually talked explicitly about some of these things. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's really interesting is that, you know, even though we both come from, you know, elite educational backgrounds as far as college is concerned, I don't think we've even very much talked about those experiences either. Yeah. So hopefully we'll get into a little bit of that stuff today and just offline as well. I'm definitely down for that conversation. I know we've had a fair share of arguments about a lot of this stuff, and you know, far be it from me to say that I have any of the answers, but it's really cool just to think about this stuff in the context of your background and things that you've been through. Mm-hmm. Okay, so questions are coming in. We have 7. I'm gonna ask 8 questions now. I'm gonna ask a couple questions to give people more time to send stuff in. The questions are looking really good, guys. So I would encourage you to send more. We wanna keep this man talking while we can. Okay, so I wanted to actually start out by asking you some questions about how this came to be. You know, as I said, I didn't get the chance to hear, I mean, like, you know, this kind of just came out of nowhere for me. So how did it all come together? Like, you know, how did you find out about this? Like, tell me that part of the story.
Well, this is one of those stories that kind of fell out of the sky. It was essentially a tip. Someone who I grew up with, a friend of my family when I was a kid, had been a participant in the Stouffer Foundation program.
Really?
He, in the 60s, went to integrate a school called the Asheville School in North Carolina. And I was very much linked with his children during my kind of educational journey as a child. So when Atlanta was, I grew up in Atlanta, when Atlanta was making moves to enact what was called a minority to majority program, where students from Black neighborhoods mostly could go to white schools, I would carpool with his kids. His kids eventually went to private school. I ended up going to private school later on. And so we've kind of had parallel educational journeys, but I didn't know about this history of his. And so about 5 years ago, he knew that I was a reporter at the Times. I was on staff at the Times then, and he was in the process of organizing a reunion of the students who participated in this program and wanted to kind of figure out a way to let the world know about what happened. So he just wrote me on Facebook. We hadn't talked in 15 years or something, in a long time, and told me about this. And immediately I was like, this is my story. And I kind of set about the work of getting to know the people who were involved. And you know, it started with a big group of people, and then finding the ones who would be the characters in my story. And now I'm kind of going through that process again to find people who will be characters in the book. But that's how it started.
Great. It's really interesting because I was just thinking about how, like, in the hands of a lesser reporter, that tip might have gone unnoticed. I just want to say that. I mean, I think it was great that you saw the, the diamond in that rough, because, looking at a story like that, you would say, well, the Times is not going to run a story about a reunion of that's not a news story. But, you looked in that and saw this gem of a story in there in this bigger context. And so I think that's really great. So talk to us a little bit about your journey towards publishing this. Like, how long has this journey been? Like, even just publishing the first article that you wrote in the New York Times Magazine.
Right. So that tip was in 2015, and I will say that my friend's name is Greg. There was some frustration on his part that it would take me 2 years for anything to appear in print. As I mentioned, there were 140 people who I wanted to kind of get to know. I did some traveling to meet some of them, and I also did a lot of work over the phones. And so this program was in place from 1967 until 1974, essentially until it ran out of money. And I really wanted to focus on that first class because it was the ones who would be having the kind of starkest experience of being the very first. I made a lot of phone calls, and it came to focus on one school, Virginia Episcopal School, and started the process of reporting and getting to know all the people who were in the first 2 classes there. And so the stories came out in September of 2017. There was the print piece that I did for the magazine, and a podcast episode that I did for This American Life. And that was really special. That came into being because during my research, I discovered these archival audio recordings, which was just one of those moments as a reporter where I, couldn't really believe what I was finding, this great, these young people from now 50 years ago talking about their experiences. And it was so rich that I really wanted it to have kind of the full storytelling potential. So I was working on those 2 stories in parallel.
Okay, that's wonderful.
And they came out in 2017.
Okay. And last question that I wanted to ask you about this was about, what you went through, like what you were thinking about, like what was your thought process as you went through thinking about pitching this, right? Because I think this is something that you and I have talked about, is about the world's receptivity to this particular type of story. So what was that like?
Well, I was a little worried that the integration narrative was too familiar, that people felt like they already knew that story. And I also was a little worried that people would find it relevant because it is, it's a very old story at this point. But I felt that the private school element of it had not ever been written about. That's not true. There was one Ebony magazine story in the 70s, but had not been written about in a long time for a general audience. And the program had this element of it that was probably most interesting to me, which was that it wasn't just a scholarship program. It had this kind of design. Today we would use the word anti-racism. It had this design to change white attitudes. So I thought that there would be, I guess correctly, that there would be some interest in that. And so at that point, it became, the issue for me became narrative. I'm often thinking in terms of narrative, despite the fact that there are all of these, thorny issues. It's really about stories for me, and I wanted to find a story that was gripping. And so at that point, that's what I was working on, and that's kind of how I sealed it with the editors.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you for indulging me in nerding out on journalism. We got some good questions here from the audience. We're up to 13 now. Let me start going through to choose some of these. I think that I'm going to start out with some of the more factual questions that people have about how the program worked, because I think that it might engender other questions, and then we can go to get into more of the opinion-oriented stuff. One of the really good questions here is, how did the foundation get the all-white prep schools to admit their Black scholarship awardees?
So there were pretty high-level conversations between this foundation, which was the people who I mentioned in my remarks, and the board members or the presidents of the various schools. So they would basically kind of have these meetings and try to convince the school leadership that it was in their interest to do this. It's worth saying that this did not always work out. There were many schools that declined, who saw the potential for revolt among their parents and the students, and who worried about people pulling their tuition money away from the schools. But essentially there were negotiations that opened the doors. And what is also very significant is that the Stouffer Foundation offered to recruit the Black students, so the schools would have to do none of the work of finding these exceptional students, and offered to pay for them and all of their expenses. So they essentially made it very easy for them to say, listen, all you have to do is open your doors. We will provide the talent, and the rest is done.
Okay, all right, I got it. Now that was a really good question, one that I hadn't really thought about. This is a related question, actually. Were there some or a lot of parents who pulled their children out of the participating schools and moved them to other schools?
Yes, definitely. There were, the answer to that question is yes. There were, parents even began to organize themselves, and there were letter writing campaigns and attempts to convince various board members to not to accept this offer. Some board members ended up resigning over this program. So many parents ended up taking their schools out and taking their kids out and sending them to what were called segregation academies, which were, schools founded after desegregation for the express purpose of staying all white.
Okay. I have another question here about how this worked. This person's asking, can you comment on the other influencers of Ann Forsyth besides John Ely? Who else influenced her? Who else was she?
Yeah, so Ann Forsyth was a progressive philanthropist who was kind of orbiting in the circle of the governor of North Carolina at the time, Terry Sanford. And Terry Sanford was a Democrat and was a governor while there was a conservative legislature, and was having trouble getting anything done in terms of his kind of progressive policy initiatives. So he began to recruit wealthy people to finance programs around the state of North Carolina, experimental programs to work on some of his policy initiatives. And before the Stouffer Foundation was founded, this group of people around Terry Sanford started an anti-poverty program that sent students, Black students and white students, into small towns around North Carolina to organize people. And one of the two key features of this program were that the students were living together. The Black students and white students, men and women, boys and girls, were living together. And also that these students had to keep journals as a part of this effort. And the journals were monitored is not the right word, they were read to see how the program was going. And one thing that they found in this program is that the Black students and the white students who lived together and had the white students in particular, had these experiences where they came to see all of these privileges and prejudices that they had, and had these conversion experiences. And so Ann Forsyth watched this closely, and she also was paying for it. And so she came to see it as a model for what these other schools could do.
Okay, I got it. Here's another good question this is also a question about kind of the nuts and bolts of this. Really, it's more sort of about their philosophy, really. Why do you think the philanthropists thought proximity to Black students would work in boarding schools, but not for white people who worked side by side with Black people in stores, farms, construction sites, etc.?
Yeah. Their thinking was that the people in these schools would become the leaders of the South. They would become lawmakers, they would become bankers, they would be in a position to hire, to make policy, to change things. And it was kind of a trickle down social policy initiative. They thought that by changing these future white leaders, they would eventually kind of change the whole region.
Trickle down, that's a good way of describing it, actually.
Mm-hmm.
This is a question about the experience from the perspective of the young Black boys who participated. And just for clarification, it was all boys, right?
I was just about to say, the very first class was all boys. But I think in the third year, girls began to be admitted. Most of them were all girls schools, and then there were a few co-ed schools.
Okay. So this is a question about their experiences. So how old were the boys who were featured in this lecture when they were sent to this school? Can you tell us something about how these kids managed their new situation?
Yeah, they were very young, 13, 14, for the most part, entering ninth grade. And the pressure that they were under was incredible, because just think about it, they were living in segregated neighborhoods and towns, and in the kind of situation where everybody in those places is looking to them to be representative of the best of the Black community. So they have the weight of the community on them, and they have to kind of go into these schools and perform. It was also the case that there wasn't a lot of, the program didn't provide a lot of kind of softer support, the kind of things that we would see today in terms of, counseling or anything like that. And so the only kind of way that they had to counteract any type of prejudice or hostility that they faced was to outperform their white classmates. And so that's what many of them did. One of my favorite things about this story is that there were 15 or 20, I don't remember exact number, valedictorians in this program, which means that the very first Black student in these all white schools went in and became the very best time, like almost 20% in 20% of cases, which to me is incredible. The flip side of that is that pressure really tracked some people, and that played out in their high school careers, and to some extent in the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I remember from your magazine story, there was one boy who, did he not complete his school? Did he drop out? Did he leave?
He did finish, but after graduation, he kind of disappeared.
I see.
Yeah, he suffered physical abuse during his, like physical bullying during his time there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that.
Had a really tough time.
Difficult to read. This person had a couple follow-up questions too. Do you think this experiment might have been more successful with younger children? I don't even know if that's feasible, given that most boarding schools will start at an older age, but at least in the South, did the Black students perceive this as a success? That was another follow-up question this person had.
Yeah, younger students. I mean, I could only guess. I would say that perhaps children who were younger would be kind of more malleable. That's kind of one of the things that they were counting on in this program is kind of the white students in particular, their ability to be shaped outside of the influence of their parents, and perhaps that is more possible with younger students. But that's just kind of a guess. Mm-hmm. But the second part of the question was,
did the Black students perceive this as a success? This is sort of a theme that I'm seeing across questions, actually.
Yeah.
What did the Black students?
I would say yes. The educational opportunities were great, even though these schools had, it was a very certain kind of somewhat conservative education, very kind of like status quo kind of, working your way into the elite kind of education. But the educations did open doors for the Black students. Many of them went on to Ivy League and elite schools they wouldn't have been exposed to. Many of them went to much better schools than they would have gone to if they had remained in public school. Another kind of psychological and emotional change that many of them told me about was that, as young people, they were confronted constantly with images, media, expectations that they were not as good as white young people. And it was something that the experience helped them to finally shake off, because they saw up close that they were just as good and oftentimes better. And so that is something that a lot of people carried with them, and also a comfort, or not a comfort, but an ease around white people that would benefit them later in their lives. There's also been some research on a separate program that was run out of the North, sociological research, longitudinal, looking at results of a different scholarship program, and it found that it was very successful in moving people into the middle and upper middle class.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. I'm actually going to switch into ask a little bit more personal questions about you, and then I'm going to go back to the questions. So can you talk a little bit about what your private school experience was like? When did you start? What had been your level of exposure to white people before you started attending?
So I started private school in 9th grade, the beginning of high school. In 7th and 8th grade, I guess in most public schools, there are all these standardized tests. And I performed well in them, and that kind of got me, it opened some opportunities for various kinds of scholarship programs. And so I was accepted to a program called A Better Chance, which is a national program that very much like the Stouffer Foundation sends minority or students of color students into private schools and boarding schools. I had the option of going to boarding school, but I wasn't really ready to leave home. So I went to a day school in Atlanta called the Padilla School, where I had a very positive experience. Padilla is it's kind of known as the progressive school in Atlanta. It was founded in the 70s. I think I could fairly say by hippies. And so it had a very kind of casual, like anti-authoritarian streak to it. And I had a very positive experience there, both socially and educationally. Prior to that, my middle school was mostly Black. My elementary school was mostly white. But Atlanta is a mostly Black city. So even when I was in minority situations in school, I never really felt that kind of out of sorts, because, there are Black people everywhere in Atlanta.
Minority.
Yeah. So, it was always comfortable for me.
Okay. So how many Black kids were there with you at your school?
Each class graduated like 85 or 90 students. And I think in our class, there were maybe 12 Black people, 10 or 12. Okay. We were like usually 8 to 10%.
Oh, okay. All right. And so I'm kind of curious about how you saw, your experience with race play out there and evolve over time. Like, what was it like when you arrived, and how did it change? You're talking about the experiences of people in this book. As you think about your own life trajectory, how has it played out?
Mm-hmm. There was a Black affinity group at my high school, which was formed like a real core of my friends there. And I always felt that I had them to lean on. And so there always kind of felt like there was an emotional core that had a lot of my background when I was in high school. I didn't suffer what I would consider racism that often. I have a teacher there who is still very close to me, who I was talking to recently, and she reminds me that I did have my battles with teachers at various points, with things that I considered racist when I was there, but it was never something that I felt like, or that we felt like we couldn't handle. And so overall, the experience was positive. As I've gotten older, the experience has become even more positive, I guess because some of the warts and the tougher memories fade, but also because I've grown really close to a lot of people who I went to high school with, and we've become even closer friends as adults. And so those friendships are really kind of color the way I think about my time now. And those are people of various backgrounds.
And how do you, and tell me if you don't really think about this much, but how, if at all, do you think the experience of socializing with Black kids changed white kids at your school, if at all?
Well, again, Atlanta's a mostly Black city, so I don't think that they were lacking in exposure. But I can say that, and I can only really speak for the people who I know closely, who are my friends from high school. But I can say that I could count on all of them today to take stances that I would consider to be anti-racist stances. I can't say how much that has to do with the education, the exposure to Black students, or what, but that is that's who they are.
Okay. That's really interesting. I'm going to go back to the questions. We have a lot of people from the South here. Yay!
Right.
Someone is here from Mississippi. A lot of people say that they're from the South, but don't identify what state that they're from. So there's a variety of questions related to that I want to go through. So the gist of a lot of those questions are, talk to me about how you feel the South has changed, right? One question is, one could say that schools, especially public today, are more segregated than ever before in the United States. Which is not necessarily a question about the South, but in general. So how do you think that this place has changed since then?
Yeah. Well, in their wildest imaginations, the founders of this program thought that they would be ushering in a new progressive South. And we can look at the electoral map and see that that is not the case. So those larger aims, I think, were unsuccessful. I think that there has been a backlash, particularly among poor and working class whites or white people, to some of the policies and things that we've seen as it relates to diversity. I think that there is a perception that they have been kind of leapt over in the social hierarchy, and that has led to a lot of their kind of conservatism, and conservatism is not, maybe that's the right word, and their attraction toward someone like our former president. And so I think that it's difficult to see wide change in the South. However, if we were to look, it's like most places. If we were to look in cities, places like Atlanta, the college towns, it's very different. Places where there are a lot of people who are living close together, there tends to be something that happens where people understand each other a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's some questions here about kind of how, where we are today as a society in the United States, I guess, is related to, programs like Stouffer. So, if I may synthesize, the question is sort of, with or Stouffer, like, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of that particular program?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think with Stouffer and programs like it, they began to define they began to shape what are our modern or our contemporary notions of diversity. By which I mean, this idea that diversity is something that benefits the majority, or that helps the majority, or whatever you want to call it, to better acclimate to kind of society as it exists. Like that type of framing was something that started with these programs. And I would argue that diversity still remains something in the way that we discuss it, in the way that we argue for it, particularly in elite high schools and colleges. It remains something that is mostly presented as a benefit to the white students who are there. And so I think that those ideas began to be shaped around the time of the Stouffer Foundation.
So, and just to extend that idea a little bit further about, what the white students got out of the program. You said that Bill and Marvin's white classmates said, I don't see color when you talked to them about, whether they had changed. Yeah. What do you think they meant by that phrase? I don't see color.
That was a tough one for me because for a long time, it took me I wanted to get a sense of what the outcomes were among their white peers, and people wouldn't really answer my question. And for a while I was wondering if it was the case that there was some shame or just kind of like an American reticence to talk about race. And there perhaps was some of that, but I also kind of came to realize that part of it was also this idea that their exposure to Bill and Marvin and to the other students in this program had brought them to this point where they didn't really even have to talk about race anymore. Like, because they were on the football team together, because they kind of had these camaraderie, which was probably sincere, that they didn't really have to think about it anymore. And so I became to see their kind of reluctance to answer as also evidence of them of their thinking having changed. But not necessarily in a positive, not necessarily in a progressive way. You know what I mean? Oh.
I had to mute myself. I keep thinking about, the historical research into relationships between Black and white people, pre-Jim Crow even, and about the often close social relationships that existed, during slavery, for example, and even during Jim Crow, when Black and white children tended to grow up together up through middle school, if there was middle school for Black kids, which typically was graduation for Black children during Jim Crow, and then to separate, as high school came and boys and girls went their separate ways. And it's just interesting to me. One of the big questions in my mind is the extent to which Stouffer represented a departure from that. Was it actually an actual departure from that? It seems like in terms of exposure, it would have been, because the social practice would have been absolute separation between the races as of, when they reached adolescence. Mm-hmm. So, it's just something interesting to think about.
I think we will have to continue another time. I think we've reached our deadline. Oh. Yeah, it's time to wrap up.
Time. Are you coming back, Daniel?
I'm back, but I'm standing by in case there was another question I don't want to interrupt.
No, I think, are we good, Kelly?
2:45. There's a lot more questions here. Fortunately, Mosie's going to be reading some of these, or all of them really. So hopefully the conversation can go on a little bit further after that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Mosie, Kelly, this has been fantastic. Kelly, you brought so much, fascinating material to question Mosie with, and such a close hearing, I guess. So thank you so much, Mosie. This was fantastic. This is just an absolutely fascinating work that we look forward to seeing develop and expand and ultimately see the light of day between two hardcovers. So good luck with wrapping it up. And I want to also just thank the audience for joining us here. Before we sign off, let me just mention some coming events on December 1 at 7:30 Central European Time. We will host Professor James Green of Brown University. He is also a fellow this term, although he is not here at the Academy. And he is going to talk about the fascinating encounters of French actress Sarah Bernhardt in Brazil in the early 20th century. His talk is entitled Sarah Bernhardt's Knee, the Feminine Ideal in Belle Epoque, Rio de Janeiro. So I hope you can join us for that. James Green is Professor of Latin American History at Brown. And although he could not be here in Berlin this fall, we hope that he will join us in some future semester here at the Academy. I also just want to mention that in early December, we will also continue the virtual series Road to Election Night and Beyond, which we are doing together with several other institutions and German political foundations. And if you want to find out more about these, please go to our website, www.americanacademy.de, and DE, I'm sorry, for English speakers, and register under upcoming events. Thanks again to our speaker and our discussant, and all the best to all of you. Please take care.
Bye, thank you.